This is Charlotte Katakuri, second son of obese matriarch Charlotte Linlin, brother of 84 siblings, eater of one too many donuts at one time, which is when he ripped his mouth open, and I'm just gonna say it right here, right off the bat, the best antagonist in the entire almost 30-year history of One Piece. And I'm going to take a painful amount of time to tell you exactly why, as we are on a mission to rank every major antagonist in the series in the most comprehensive and exhaustive way possible, video by video, this time featuring Mr. Perfection himself, Charlotte Katakuri. A man who had no right I say, to casually stroll into the series as late as he did, and to be anywhere near as compelling as he was. And as part of this video, I'm also currently wearing my Cat Ukuri t-shirt, available in my store through a link in the description, many other shirts as well. But because Katakuri is a product of an era that I define as late stage pre-Wano One Piece, he actually has a different introduction in the manga than he does in the anime. And that's because in the anime, Toei were desperate for all of the filler that they could milk out of the story teat of Eiichiro Oda. And so they took Katakuri and they inserted him much earlier into the Whole Cake Island arc, as he does have an ominous cameo before we properly meet him. And it's such a simple thing, but it goes against one of the core ideas of Katakuri, which I will explain shortly. But you'd be hard pressed to find a better official introduction to a character than Katakuri in the manga, who we meet at the entrance of Big Mom's tea party, and his first act in the series is to kill a man with a jelly bean, right between the eyes as well. And the juxtaposition of the devastation this man can inflict with the most mundane and harmless of candies instantly elevates Katakuri beyond any Charlotte family member that we'd experienced to that point. With the exception of maybe Big Mom, but it's a maybe. And so Katakuri accomplishes a lot in just 2 pages, and part of this is also to do with his unusually no-nonsense design. When I was reading this chapter weekly, I could not believe that this man was a One Piece character. He initially looks like he'd be a lot more at home in a seinen manga, although Eiichiro Oda's original Katakuri design definitely feels a lot more like classic One Piece, and also fits perfectly into the lineup of Charlotte's siblings, who are this group of very wackily proportioned individuals. However, my personal theory as to why this design changed is that during Whole Cake Island, Oda suddenly realized that he would need Luffy to actually overcome an antagonist, because the major antagonist of Whole Cake Island is Big Mom, but defeating her was out of the question. So I think that what he did right was visually elevate this original Pompadour Katakuri to be able to step into the role that a more traditional arc antagonist would occupy. Although very curiously, Katakuri is one of the rare One Piece antagonists who was introduced without Oda's classic ominous villainous shading. The dude just appears out of nowhere with a full design. And I think that's very purposeful, because thematically, as readers, we are not supposed to clock Katakuri. We're not meant to see some ominous being and be aware of it as a huge threat. No. A big aspect of Katakuri's character is to be able to see into the future, and the way he is written is to leave us as readers with what feels like a knowledge deficit, which is why I really like that he gets the jump on us. We're halfway through the Whole Cake Island arc, we think we know everything it is that we need to deal with, but then this guy, he comes out of nowhere to completely perfectly ruin our plans. And as a reader, it gives me a great degree of reverence for Katakuri, because even though I, man on the internet, am real and Katakuri is fictional, somehow he is the one in charge of this experience. And long story less long, that's why I'm not a big fan of the cameo introduction that the anime gave him, because that flags Katakuri to the audience as a threat to be aware of, and so he loses a lot of that surprise and narrative command that he had in the manga, because we as an audience are already keeping track of him. Those sorts of cameos are essentially giving the audience access to Future Sight, which we don't need yet, because you definitely know what to expect in the future when you see a lingering shot of an ominous figure. And again, with Katakuri, we don't want that. We need to feel that he has superior vision over us. And we really do need to linger on this, because Katakuri is the Future Sight antagonist. Others have had this ability since him, but Katakuri was our first and strongest showcase of this advancement of observation haki. And Oda was able to use this as a great source of dramatic moments that we've never really been able to replicate with any other characters, even Luffy. Katakuri constantly uses Future Sight to give us these little flash forwards, and one of my favorite examples of this is when all of the Luffys pop out of the wedding cake. But before we see that, we have Katakuri in a state of panic because he's seeing it before we do, and he can't do anything to stop the chaos and danger that comes with this act. And shortly after this, there is a moment when Capone Gang Beige uses Katakuri's facial expression to help dictate his next move. He says that Katakuri is looking looking pretty pale, meaning that their plan is going to work and they should continue. And Capone Gang Beige then unleashes this incredible line: "You can see a bit into the future, that's all. But that ain't some special privilege. Everyone has an equal right to change the future." And that is one of the big thematic struggles between Luffy and Katakuri. Luffy proving these words that he has that equal ability to change the future when he's up against a man who can literally see into the future. But Katakuri also has a decent sense for the future in general. Even though he's not at that level yet, he very quickly comes to the conclusion that Luffy will one day become a true threat to his mother and his family, and that's why Katakuri makes the decision to pursue Luffy personally, which is very similar to Smoker's thought process after Loguetown. And this leads to quite a bit of inner conflict with Katakuri himself, because it's easy to think of him as the big bad villain man of Whole Cake Island, but in reality Katakuri also fits very cleanly into the classic princess role as well. He and his siblings are trapped under the tyranny of their rather large maternal figure, Charlotte Linlin, and deep down what Katakuri is searching for is a person who can change the future for him and his family and do the classic One Piece thing of liberating a kingdom, which leads us away from Katakuri's technical purpose in the story, which is to be used as a vehicle to teach Luffy and us, the readers, about future sight. But the real meat of Katakuri is in the concept of perfection. According to adorable sister Charlotte Brûlé, Brother Katakuri is not just undefeated. Not once in his life has his back ever touched the ground. Legend says he stood up on his own 2 feet the moment he was born. He's never laid down in his life. He's a man who even looks down on the earth. He is proud, cold, and powerful at all times, the perfect man. And he was then referred to as the, quote, greatest masterpiece of the Charlotte family, a title that Katakuri created for himself purely to be able to protect his siblings. As a child, Katakuri's sister Charlotte Brûlé was targeted by a gang of kids because Katakuri beat them up after they made fun of his mouth due to the donut incident where he ripped it open. But after all of that, Katakuri decided that for the sake of his family's safety, he was going to hide his mouth and never show any weakness or flaw in any fiber of his being. He took on the philosophy of perfection for the safety of others. And as a result, Katakuri will go to any extremes to defend this image. There's one point in his fight against Luffy where Katakuri gets flung back and he purposely slams his head into the ground just to avoid having his back hit the ground first. So the mindset here is that if Katakuri's perfection is broken, then that leaves his family vulnerable. So Luffy is initially fighting Katakuri so that his crew can escape, and Katakuri is initially fighting Luffy for the safety of his family. It's a really great take on the idea of perfection. And antagonists who believe themselves to be perfect are often quite impossible to empathize with because they actively separate themselves from humanity. A couple of One Piece based examples would be J. Garcia Saturn and God NL. Each of them believed that they were perfect beings, but Katakuri is a character that we can actually empathize with. He is a character who uses his perfection to become more human instead of less. And so as readers, or at least as me, man on the internet, I actively supported his quest for perfection because he wasn't doing it for himself. There is a greater purpose and meaning behind this image that no other antagonist in the series has backing them. And I honestly don't know if we will ever see another antagonist with this level of sheer willpower, which is equal to that of Luffy. Although this quest for perfection has turned Katakuri into something that Luffy would never become. After Pedro sacrifices himself, Katakuri says, "What's with all you people getting emotional, huh?" Indicating that in the quest for perfection, Katakuri has had to abandon such indulgences, and much of his character arc throughout his fight with Luffy is about learning to feel these emotions again. And in terms of perfection, this also connects quite strongly with the idea of future sight, because it means that Katakuri almost always has perfect information and can always make the correct move. One thing that really terrified me about Katakuri when I was reading Weekly was that he positioned himself aboard the Thousand Sunny whilst Big Mom was chasing the Straw Hats. Traditional villain logic would dictate that, we're all good now. They've got no chance against Big Mom. She'll destroy them for sure. Let's all go and do something else and get surprised that they weren't destroyed later. But Katakuri wasn't taking any chances, and I really respect that level of caution in an antagonist. It happens so frustratingly rarely. And later on, Katakuri also refuses to do the standard annoying anime and manga thing of just sitting there letting a shonen protagonist power up. The very first time that Luffy tries to use Gear Forth, Katakuri easily stops him and says, "Why must I sit back and watch you as you prepare to exhibit power-ups that I already know are coming? Straw Hat Luffy, let me be clear, I refuse to underestimate you." Which is really kind of trippy to think about, because despite positioning himself as a perfect, as as the perfect being, Katakuri is somehow completely free of arrogance, which makes him very likable, but it also sets him apart from most One Piece antagonists who are generally undone by arrogance. You got your crocodiles, you got your Doflamingos, you got your Kaidos, your Saint Saturns, and the list keeps it goes on. They're all arrogant, except this man. So Katakuri isn't going to make stupid mistakes that lead to his downfall, meaning that defeating Katakuri can only be achieved if Luffy earns it, which is something that Luffy certainly understands when he says to Brule that he wants to surpass Katakuri at his best and defeat the Billion Berry Man. And starting from this point of perfection, Oda slowly breaks Katakuri down, endearing us to his imperfection. For example, early Katakuri often speaks in absolutes. Aboard the Thousand Sunny, he says to Luffy, "You will not leave while I am here," which isn't just stereotypical villain talk. It's a carefully considered statement of confidence generated from being able to literally look into the future. And throughout Katakuri's tenure as an antagonist, it is up to Luffy to change those absolute outcomes and to live up to the words spewed by Capone Gang Beige that everyone has an equal right to change the future. And constantly overcoming the future that Katakuri sees is what forms a series of very, very slow steps towards him respecting Luffy. After changing the future for the first time, when Luffy gets Katakuri off the Thousand Sunny by forcing him into the mirror world, Katakuri even says, "Well done," not in a patronizing way either. Katakuri was offering genuine praise for the efforts of his opponent. And Luffy also confronts Katakuri's imperfections directly by catching him mid-merienda. And what's this? There's Katakuri doing all of the things it is that his legend states he didn't. Stuffing donuts blissfully into his gob whilst lying down comfortably on his back. He's even using one of the donuts as a pillow, which I love. And Katakuri himself refers to his behavior as sinful as he consumes his delicious forbidden donuts. And look, I guess he's quite right, because this is an indulgence in gluttony that clouds his vision and prevents Katakuri from killing Luffy on that one occasion. And even Katakuri's devil fruit abilities are used to present and then break the illusion of perfection. Katakuri masquerades as a Logia, using his future sight to make sure that no one can hit his mochi body, and making his opponents feel like trying to stand against him is completely useless because not even Haki seems to work on this supposedly Logia body. But once Luffy figures out that Katakuri is a special paramecia, this is a colossal mental win for him because it confirms that Katakuri is not in fact invincible or perfect, and with enough effort and willpower, even he can be brought down. Which is a huge break in perfection for Mr. Katakuri, who relies very strongly on his presentation breaking his opponents long before his fists do. And Katakuri also becomes a lot easier to hit the more emotional he becomes, whether it be anger and stress at the beginning of the fight or excitement and respect towards the end. The more emotions that Luffy is able to elicit from him, the more flawed Katakuri's fighting style becomes. But also from their very first punch, it is clear that Katakuri uses his abilities in an extremely similar way to that of Luffy, and that Oda has deliberately set up Katakuri as a mirror match for Luffy, one that takes place in a literal mirror world, which I love because it's very rare that the location of a fight ends up being of much meaningful significance. But the mirror world, it is a very in-your-face, inescapable visual metaphor of the duel that is taking place within it. The main difference, as stated by Katakuri, is the way he uses his abilities is far more efficient than how Luffy uses his. And as a result, Katakuri is able to achieve a very tangible advantage over Luffy in every single area. Combat, speed, durability, strength, versatility, whatever it is, Katakuri wins. On top of that, he's also an awakened Devil Fruit user, and Luffy is not at this point. And so there is nothing that Luffy can do that Katakuri can't do better, which is also reflected in Katakuri's bounty, which is 1,057,000,000 berries. The 57 million was chosen because 57 is one number higher than Luffy's trademark number 56. And also for me personally, Katakuri's powers are more visually compelling. Sometimes to a creepy extent, like when he divided his legs into these terrifying mochi tendrils, and sometimes to a hilarious extent, like when he turned his whole body into a donut to avoid Luffy's attacks. To me, this whole fight is a masterpiece, not just of One Piece or of manga, but it's a real treasure of media in general, as the choreography is on point in each and every single panel panel, and all of the hits feel viscerally brutal. Every hit landed on either Luffy or Katakuri feels painful, but at the same time, each of these panels are works of art of their own, and this fight, in my opinion, is Oda's combat renaissance, and one that I don't think we've reached the heights of either before or since in One Piece. But this puts us in a bit of a rough position, because if Katakuri is just flat out superior, then how could Luffy ever beat him without it feeling like, bullshit? Well, there is one and only one weapon that Luffy effectively wields against Katakuri in this fight, which is the battle of willpower and reasoning that is taking place in the mental realm. Katakuri has an extremely tough time understanding Luffy, and whilst most antagonists probably wouldn't care, and they generally don't care, that understanding is very important for Katakuri, and trying to understand Luffy changes him. After briefly escaping the mirror world and then returning, Katakuri can't even comprehend why Luffy came back to the fight. He can only think of three options. 1, Luffy preferred death to the shame of running away and being a coward. 2, Luffy was prepared to recognize Katakuri's superiority. Or 3, Luffy wanted to work for Katakuri. But when Luffy says that he came back to defeat Katakuri, Mr. Perfection coolly states that that wasn't an option, because Katakuri has this perfect balance as an antagonist. At this point, he 100% believes that Luffy winning isn't possible, and again, somehow he's not speaking from a place of arrogance. He's not underestimating Luffy as everyone else has done before and after him. Katakuri just knows what the future holds, and it is incumbent on Luffy to break that. Katakuri physically dominates a good 95% or even more of this fight, and while he's able to deal some pretty extreme damage to Luffy's body, Katakuri never once manages to damage Luffy's drive and willpower, which I think is most potently demonstrated during this series of panels of Luffy taking a beating, but making fierce, determined eye contact with Katakuri as if he is still well and truly in this fight, which is a seed that leads to the mental unraveling of Katakuri, who just can't figure out why that light won't disappear from Luffy's eyes. And furthermore, Katakuri does start to panic and invest more emotionally the closer and closer that Luffy gets to using Future Sight at will, as Luffy inches closer and closer to being able to use Katakuri's own abilities. So the longer this fight goes on, the more physically overwhelmed Luffy is being, and the more mentally overwhelmed Katakuri is being. And also, there's a very key point where Katakuri starts to see a lot of himself within Luffy, particularly when Luffy states that his crew thinks he's gonna win because they believe in him. This is a hugely underrated moment in this fight, and to be fair, it doesn't have a lot of meaning until you later fully understand Katakuri's motivations, but in this moment, it is clear that the Straw Hats have the same faith and belief in Luffy as Katakuri's family have in him. Luffy isn't perfect, and in fact, he's just the opposite of perfection in every way. Later on in the fight, Luffy even starts yelling out a bunch of stuff like how hungry he is and how much pain he's in, which he justifies by saying that yelling all of these things makes me feel better, as opposed to Katakuri, who still has all of these feelings but keeps them bottled up in the name of perfection. And yet, with all of these unsightly imperfections, Luffy is still able to manifest that same level of hope, inspiration, and respect that Katakuri has gone to some pretty tremendous extremes to achieve. And so Luffy didn't intend to do this, but he is showing Katakuri that there is another way to become the man he wants to be. And in Katakuri's own words, after this moment, he was starting to admit that Luffy was worthy. And that is when Flampe happens. Charlotte Flampe is Katakuri's younger sister and president of the Katakuri fan club, which is a thing that exists on Whole Cake Island, and Flampe, in her quest to maintain her idol's perfection, decides to interfere with the fight to remove the struggle from Katakuri, because perfect beings cannot be allowed to struggle. So she interferes with the fight battle, and Katakuri inflicts a winning, decisive blow on Luffy. And rather than being pleased, Katakuri is initially furious, absolutely livid that Luffy lost focus in battle. Katakuri actually gets so angry that the light he wanted to snuff out so badly is actually gone. But after realizing Flampe interfered, Katakuri inflicted the same wound on himself, and he does this for a couple of reasons. One, because Katakuri's definition of perfection would not allow him to attain victory via the help of others. If the fight had ended here, then it would be as good as conceding that Katakuri could not beat Luffy without help. And secondly, because Katakuri had started to identify with Luffy so strongly that Katakuri believed that Luffy had every right to continue this contest to fight on behalf of those who believe in him, the same way that Katakuri does for his family. That same family who just interfered with the fight, mind you. And as part of this, Katakuri also reveals his face and embraces his imperfections for the first time. When two men are fighting, the last thing I need is some half-assed assistance. If you're gonna laugh at that idiot, then laugh at me too. A very emotional outburst as Katakuri gets closer and closer to taking on Luffy's mental characteristics, whilst Luffy gets closer and closer to learning how to use Katakuri's abilities. And as time goes on, this becomes far less of a protagonist versus antagonist affair, but more of a protagonist versus protagonist fight, which is an extremely impressive accomplishment that I don't think anyone else in this video series can claim. The fact that Katakuri was a solid enough character to rival Luffy in his own story and make me root for him every bit as much as I did for Luffy. It really is a perfect example of how a good battle manga is written, which is to use fights to develop characters. And Katakuri is a character developed to perfection almost exclusively through this one fight battle. Plus, antagonists that bring out a new Luffy transformation always have a very special place in One Piece history, which is why against all odds people still have vivid memories of Blueno, because he was the first person who Luffy used Gear 2nd against, as well as Rob Lucci with Gear 3rd, Doflamingo with 4th, now Katakuri with Snake Man, and in the future Kaido with Gear 5th. But in this case we have Snake Man, a bespoke power-up designed for Luffy to specifically deal with Katakuri. It involves sacrificing most of the strength offered by Gear 4th and instead focusing on speed and reach. Luffy was purposely trying to combat Future Sight by designing an attack that would eventually hit, and so the pressure was put on Katakuri to continuously use Future Sight to dodge these impossibly fast homing fists coming at him from otherwise unpredictable directions. And even then, it was not enough to bring Katakuri down. All of Luffy's immense physical process is still overcome by this man. And so this fight reaches a conclusion that's still debated to this very day, as Luffy gets up one last time and Katakuri deliberately falls onto his back, conceding the fight, as well as conceding his own legend and accepting his imperfection. So there's an argument to say that Katakuri could have physically continued, and I do think that if he was driven enough, he could have beaten Luffy. But that's not the point of this ending. The point is that by this stage, Katakuri had undergone a full character arc from antagonist to protagonist, and rather than seeing Luffy as a threat to his family, Katakuri began to see Luffy as the hope for his family, as someone who could continue to evolve, defy the foreseeable future, and one day return to Whole Cake Island to liberate the Charlotte siblings from Big Mom. So Katakuri had no reason left to fight. In fact, he now had an active investment in Luffy's safety and subsequent escape from Whole Cake Island, which is such a wonderfully unique way for a One Piece fight to end. Almost every other antagonist is knocked unconscious by some big final attack, which is usually, but not always, fist-based. But this fight ended in mutual respect, as shown by Luffy covering Katakuri's face before leaving, as both of them achieved what they needed. And in retrospect, something else very notable about Katakuri is that this is the last great pre-Gear 5th fight, as Gear 5th has very much changed Luffy's dynamic with subsequent antagonists, which is a balance that I think Oda is still trying to find between that maximum freedom and actually being able to give Luffy a challenge. But I don't think we will ever see another fight like Luffy versus Katakuri in One Piece again. This was the peak of a very specific era that no longer exists. And furthermore, this fight was one of Luffy's longest, as it took 12 hours in world, meaning that it took Luffy infinitely longer to beat Katakuri than it did to beat Kaido, which we know because a lot of the Kaido fight is timed the moment he lifts up Onigashima, and there is a point where it gets contained to within a window of 5 minutes. So the entire raid on Onigashima, including Kaido's defeat, was only a couple of hours at most. And Katakuri's legacy continues well beyond his tenure, as every time Future Sight comes up, I am reminded of the groundwork laid by Katakuri and the rewards that Luffy fought his absolute hardest to obtain, such as during the Udon prison segment of Wano, where Luffy stopped Babanuki's Excite shot because he saw a quote, pretty bad future. Small moments like that have so much weight behind them, and that is all thanks to Katakuri. And this is also a legacy that has not gone unrewarded by fans. In the World Top 100 character poll, Katakuri was voted by One Piece fans all around the world as the 14th most popular character out of well over 1,000 choices, making him officially the most popular antagonist in all of One Piece. His nearest rivals were Crocodile in 17th place and Doflamingo in 20th. However, after that, you need to go all the way to 43rd and 46th place to even find another antagonist antagonists in the top 50, being Rob Lucci and Blackbeard respectively. Only five antagonists crack the top 50, and Katakuri was the only one to come within striking distance of the top 10. Katakuri is just a character on a different level, carrying out such a flawless antagonist arc that he set an impossibly high standard that I don't think any other had reached before or since. Mr. Imperfect turns out to be the perfect antagonist to me, and I don't think that S tier accurately defines just how well Katakuri did in this story, so what I need to do is open up a very special donut tier category that sits above all just for Katakuri, and you let me know in the comments which antagonist you'd like to see ranked next.